I'm going to talk just a little bit about the context in which the course that I'm going to talk about took place, and that this colloquium that we're in takes place. So the global, and then I'm going to go into talking about the tour called Monument to Extraction that my class last spring created. So I'm just going to get into the right view. All right. So the Global Urban Humanities Initiative is a project that started back in 2013. And the Mellon Foundation gave a grant to UC Berkeley to find new ways of looking at cities and urban life by bringing together the arts and humanities and architecture, landscape architecture, and city planning. And so for the past 8+ years, we have been creating team taught courses that have been going around the world. And now we got a new grant from Mellon starting last year, in which we are focusing locally and trying to create long-term relationships with community partners to take the kind of experiments and methods of looking at cities that we developed in these various studio courses and bringing it to more local and to a more kind of, with a more of a problem solving or community engaged lens. So in the past, we were doing a lot of field work. This was a studio course that went to Southern China. So field work, an iterative studio process, hands-on creation, and drawing from the traditions both of architecture and planning and the close reading, the formal analysis of the humanities. This is what we were trying to bring together. So students went to China, they went to Mexico City, they went to the US-Mexico border, Lagos, Nigeria. And we were experimenting with ways of looking at cities. And some of the methods we used were kind of traditional urban observation methods used by urban planners and urban designers, looking at people, counting people, how did they behave, creating maps. We also brought in methods from performance, using our bodies, imagining how bodies operate in public space. And so creating performances was one way both of expressing our research and of doing research. And the final work products that students created in all of these studio courses, which we called research studios. So they weren't design studios. If you're an architecture or planning student, you have an idea that a studio is presenting some kind of a design proposal. That's not what we were doing. We were kind of creating films and slideshows and installations and other ways of expressing performances or research about cities. So I encourage you to take a look at our old website, Global Urban Humanities. It's not a live website now, but it's a really great archive. You can look especially in the section that has a list of our graduate courses, because we started as a graduate program, then became undergraduate as well. A list of our past speakers, our courses. It's just kind of a good place if you're interested in the approaches of this course to find more people working in this realm. And I encourage you also to look at our future histories, our current website, where you can find not only our courses, our speakers, but also our alumni list is kind of interesting. So you can see where our students have taken this training and this work. It's a really interesting group of people. So before I jump into my presentation on the tour that we created at the Albany Bulb, I just want to make sure that everybody knows, I announced on the first day of class, but also we offer a certificate in urban humanities, and it only takes 3 courses, one of which needs to be one of our humanities studio courses. And then you can take 1 course in the College of Environmental Design and 1 in the College of Letters and Science, or you can take 3 of our custom designed Future Histories Lab courses, and that will get you this certificate. We offer a lot of classes in the summer. I encourage you to take a look at our website at our summer courses. The colloquium, because it's just 1 or 2 units, it doesn't count as one of the electives. If you really feel like you want to keep going in the direction of what you're developing in this colloquium and you want to do an independent study, add another couple units, that way, that might be another option for fulfilling one of the elective requirements. So you can talk to me about that if you'd like. So just so I have a sense of who is here, I understand there are a number of students in the MCP program. How many of you are Master in City Planning students? Great. And could a couple of folks who are not in that program tell me what your department or your major is?
Yeah, I'm a third year doing global studies.
Global studies.
I'm an
Architecture PhD. Great.
I'm a senior undergraduate in economics and history.
Economics and history. Great. Yeah. Development practice.
I'm a first year MA in
Folklore studies. Wonderful. Yeah.
Master of Public Affairs students in the School of Public Policy.
Public policy. Great. Anybody else?
second year in
Anthropology. I love the mix of students we get. It's so rich. And that's what we try to bring together, is just the conversations across disciplines, different habits of thoughts, different ways of expressing ourselves, different ways of looking at cities. That has been one of the richest things that we've enjoyed in Global Urban Humanities and in Future Histories Lab. So the tour that my students created in a class that I taught, that was a Future Histories Lab studio last spring. It was called Ghosts and Visions, using installations and augmented reality to tell history in place, or something like that. And it was listed in art and art practice and in city planning. And our goal was to tell the story not of the landfill where we were creating the tour, but rather to use it as an observatory from which to tell stories of California. And the presentation I'm showing today, I originally put together for a conference recently that was about the inclusive museum. And for me, that was a really useful framing, because we were creating installations and a tour and augmented reality and a virtual tour. But really we were kind of turning this dump into a kind of guerrilla museum. And I think it's useful because in this colloquium, we're talking not just about stories about place, we're talking about telling stories in place. So what's the difference between telling a story and saying, this is what happened right here, versus telling a story about somewhere else? So Monument to Extraction was the name of it. Our goal was to make history present. And as a key word to think about today, I want to focus on the word present, and I'll come back to that. But when we talk about storytelling in place, there are various tools and techniques and objects, right, that we can use. Monuments are one way of telling, this happened here. Tours are another place. When we name streets or buildings, that's another way of place-based storytelling. And also the rituals and festivals and performances and habits that people use to remember place are sometimes these kind of ephemeral and performative techniques are among the most effective, because they are repeated, because people have to make an effort to do it. Robert Musil said, there's nothing more invisible than a monument. There's so many monuments that we walk past every day. There's so many buildings with names that we have no idea who the person was. But think of how effective, for example, Civil War battlefield reenactments have been in keeping alive the myth of the lost cause. These kind of rituals and performances that take effort and that people are putting effort into every year, they are, for better or worse, extremely effective. And I think it's something to think about. Sometimes the ephemeral may be more effective than something made of stone that you just continually walk past. So one of the main questions we had in creating this tour, because we were experimenting with using the technology of augmented reality, where you point your phone at something and then it augments where you are by adding something. And you can see the students were experimenting with trying this. And one of the central questions we had is this technology helping us tell the story? Is it making us more present in the place, or is it taking us away? Is it a help making us more present, or is it a distraction? So, in thinking about presence, there's a sense of being present, just either physically, or being present in the sense of being mindfully present. We were also thinking about present as gift, which in its etymology is related, but we wanted to present the visitor with the gift of some kind of experience. And so that was another way that we were thinking of presence. I think what is past, present, and future? If we think of the adverb presently, he will be here presently. That doesn't mean now, it means he will be here very soon. But where does now and the future, what's the difference between those things? So I'm kind of fascinated actually just with this presentation, the presentation that I'm giving now, the presentation of history also comes from the idea of what is present at the place, what I am presenting to you as a gift. And then, we segue into the question of representation. And so everything we're talking about in storytelling is a question of representation. Who gets to tell the story? Who owns the gift? Is it your gift to give? If it's a story, are you sharing a gift that somebody else has given to you? All of these things are important to think about, especially in the use of technology. So in order for us to be present and use our bodies, I want us to do a little tiny exercise to give you a sense also of some of the things we did in our class. So for now, first keep your eyes open, and we're going to do it in a way that we can do it sitting at our desk, but just reach toward the ceiling and then stretch out your fingers till you really feel the tendons. Okay, and then make a fist, a tight fist, and then just let go. And now just let your hands rest, palms up on your lap, and just feel the blood kind of flowing into your hands. And now close your eyes and feel the weight of your body on your seat and the contact and the gravity pulling your sits bones into your chair and your feet on the floor. And take a deep breath down into your belly. And breathe out. And now think of the building connecting to the land and the land under our feet and where we are. And imagine 20,000 years ago, we would have been more than 30 miles from the coastline. So San Francisco Bay would have been a river valley. The shoreline, Ocean Beach wouldn't have been there. The beach would have been way out by the Farallon Islands. So that's a long time ago. And now think of a couple hundred years ago when this was the territory of the Chochenyo speaking Ohlone people. And now I want you to open your eyes, and instead of kind of imagining what life was like before European settlement, I want you to think of a couple of very concrete questions about the Ohlone people who are here today, who are here still in the East Bay. What are things that you don't know? And just think to yourself, just write down a couple of concrete questions of things that, I know there are lots of things that I don't know about Native American peoples and how they're organized and what they're up to and their relationships and finish it.
I want to get rid of that thing. Oh, this is what you're.
Thanks. And the reason that I asked us to be present in our bodies and use our senses, but then also to think about some facts that we may or may not know. That's part of what we tried to do in this tour. We want people to connect directly with the senses and the sensations there, but also not to kind of just come up with fantasies or images of the old days, or to imagine that this was pristine wilderness. It was not pristine. It was lived in. It was used. The people who lived here managed the land, stewarded the land, did cultural burning. It was not uninhabited or wilderness. And that's one thing that we really want to think about in creating tours, and also in doing, how do we do it? What is a good land acknowledgement? What does that mean? Why do we even do it? So I think that rather than doing a perfunctory land acknowledgement at the beginning of any talk saying it's our obligation to go out from here and educate ourselves on whatever question you have, see if you can find the answer. Rather than passively just saying, okay, we checked that box off, we did a land acknowledgement. One source you might not know about, the UC Berkeley Native Student Development Office has a website. You can just Google Native Student Development at Berkeley, and there's a lot of interesting information there. So anyway, so kind of sensory experiences, facts, and history. That's what we're about. So this is the Albany Bulb landfill, which sticks out in San Francisco Bay, and it sticks out about a mile from the mainland. It's about 4 miles northwest of where we are now. Has anybody had a chance to take the tour yet? Oh, several people, great, okay. So my presentation will make sense. I'm gonna show it for folks who haven't been also. Okay, so this landfill was in operation as a dump from 1963 to 1983, but because it was never capped, there's a lot of debris, concrete, rebar, and so on that artists have used for years. It's a pretty large scale, uncapped or partially capped landfill, and it's really known for the art that is made mostly out of local materials, and it also has been known as a place where unhoused people lived for years, off and on, until they were finally evicted in 2014. And the first project I did at the Bulb was working with people who lived there to do some collaborative mapping and oral histories that resulted in an exhibition that was curated by Robin Lasser at San Jose State. And this was art by the people at the Bulb, about people at the Bulb, by others, documentary films mapping. It was a pretty large project that was depicting one aspect of this place. The current project started out and was inspired by a global project called Extraction: Art on the Edge of the Abyss, which is looking at extractive industries, really focusing on mining around the world. And we were invited to create some kind of contribution to this project. And because the Bulb is made out of materials extracted from the earth, it seemed like a good place to think about some of the themes there. So the class started with a curatorial statement that I had written that kind of framed how we were going to be looking at this place and looking at the landscapes around this place as a way of thinking about extraction. And so the location that you see on the East Bay, it's on San Francisco Bay, which is the largest estuary on the West Coast. We're not focused just on that yellow spot. We're thinking about that yellow spot in context, in the larger context. So what we were examining was, again, looking at the yellow dot. If you look west from that dot, it gives you a chance to think about global supply chains and all the things that we import from China and the impact that our consumption has on landscapes around the world. The shoreline of San Francisco Bay, the whole west coast of the US, was completely transformed by industrialization and the war effort during World War II. And so thinking about the connections of US empire, over this huge area of the Pacific and how it impacted, the marsh vegetation enrichment is another thing that we were looking at. You can see from this map the Central Valley, which drains 40% of the area of California. That is home to industrial agriculture. And so where we are now, with all of that water draining out through the tiny entrance of the Golden Gate, it's a good place to think about that agriculture, 19th century mining in the Sierras also. All of that sediment, all of that hydraulic mining sediment is, a lot of it is still under our feet in the bay. So we're looking at a much larger context from this spot. That was our goal. And so we are looking, for example, at the oil refineries in Richmond. That's a spatial context. The temporal context is this is happening. Of course, we were putting this together in 2021 in the midst of Black Lives Matter, in the midst of the pandemic, in the midst of the epidemic of anti-Asian violence. And so this is a moment when we are rethinking how we remember history in public space, and people are challenging traditional ways and traditional stories. So that this is the moment in which we're doing this. So, the bulb has had a tradition of political art. This was a project that I helped organize last year, creating Say Their Names Memorial. And so the context of artistic and other interventions at the bulb, we were working in a context in which all the art is ephemeral and all the art gets altered, and yet it's very large scale. Often it looks like it's made of concrete, which it is, but at the same time it's always changing. So that's kind of the context in which we were intervening. So just to describe kind of the tour, the idea was that by doing this 1 mile round trip walk, you would end up hearing the stories of Chinese laborers working in the dynamite factories, which was very nearby, just where the racetrack is. You would learn the Cordnices village history of how World War II impacted industrial history and created both residential segregation and desegregation, and then resegregation. We looked at both the oil industry, at transportation, and how that affects land use at a large scale. There's bricks lying around all over the place, so we looked at bricks, but the students also did a really interesting job of using bricks as a way, again, of thinking of segregation and the exclusionary zoning that Berkeley pioneered. The students also looked at agriculture and food, because you can look out and almost see, the Pixar studios in Emeryville, which is where the Del Monte canning factory used to be. And you also have great views of container shipping and oh yeah.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just wondering whether that speak to how you chose these 8 sites and what that process was like, and if there were other sites you were considered as part of this work too.
Yeah, I think so. I'll just jump in and say that, I would say the site selection was based on, we wanted a reasonable amount of accessibility. So although some of them are a little bit hard to clamber to, we wanted it to be not too hard to find, although the treasure hunt aspect is part of it. We chose them largely based on what you can see from that spot. Like, do you have a good view of where the dynamite factories are? Also, what is the material at hand? If we're talking about steel, it's nice to have a piece of steel slag there. So we were jumping off from the materials at hand, and then also thinking about what you can see from that spot.
Did you know that you wanted to make one of the stops on the site the Pacific Coast Oil Company, or you knew that you could see it from part of the site, and so then you built a spot?
Yeah, so I knew that there were a number of natural stories to tell if the theme is extraction, right? Because there are materials. There's concrete, there's steel, there is, and then there are views, right? So I gave the students a list of, these are some of the things we can look at. And we didn't end up doing much on sand mining or concrete. And we didn't do steel manufacturing. That was all up and down the East Bay, because we had 12 students, and they were in teams of 2 mostly, and they chose what they were interested in pursuing. So from that menu, that's how we ended up doing these particular stories. And I would say the students were really deeply interested in issues of equity. And so that pulled us more into the questions. Let's get deeply into, like, bricks. There are a million things you could say about bricks, but they said, hey, these are the bricks that are used at Claremont Court to make that gateway that says, no person not of white descent can buy a house here. So that's kind of how it evolved within a curatorial framework and an idea of, these are the materials, these are the industries that were here, along with the student interests. So as I said, it was a little bit of a treasure hunt. And one student, Kim Pack, as her own project, created a virtual tour she did 360 views, and I'll show you a bit of that later, which was really great. So you don't even have to go. Amy Deng, one of our students, created the website where you can see a lot of the stories. We had Haley Gray, who is a journalism student, who took the lead on editing the podcast, which was great. So the students each student created an art installation and some kind of activation image for the augmented reality, which was usually a mosaic. They wrote a story, like a kind of short encyclopedia type article for the website, and they created an audio score. So each student did a lot of work across a lot of different media. And so here's an example of one of the mosaics, taking off on the riveter icon that they installed. And another factor in site location was there a good piece of concrete to put the mosaic on? So you can see that we are, the bulb is a palimpsest, right? So there's so many layers. And, so this particular mosaic ended up on top of a piece of graffiti. The hearts were already there. We were just adding to the layers, and we don't expect that these will last forever either. These are going to get altered too. We're participating in a process of art creation and destruction. So, and this was a good size. This chunk of concrete was the right size, so that's where that story is. So you can see we were using a borrowed landscape. So we're telling the story of the Chinese immigrants coming through the Golden Gate. You can see the Golden Gate. You can see, the San Francisco skyline. So we were really trying to jump off from the place. One student team created a installation, an art piece about bricks that was interactive. So the point was you can put bricks in and out of this framework and think about your own participation in either contributing to or dismantling the residential segregation that they were talking about. At the same time, they were also, another one of these sculptures helped you look across to where the brick factories in Richmond were. We really were happy that, people who were just out walking their dogs would happen upon the art, be drawn in, look at the QR code, which was another way of entering the experience. And I think that's a really interesting question in place-based storytelling is, it's one thing to get people who are really interested in reading history books or going to museums. They're an audience who's going to be interested in what you have to tell. But in terms of making change in the world, in terms of broadening conversations, how can we draw in people who, we were really happy when people happened upon our stories. And we used we repurposed some of the homemade benches and to, be a place to sit and contemplate the stories. The racetrack grandstand is where the dynamite factories used to be. And these are some of the names that one of the students discovered of some of the people who had actually worked and died at this place. And again, the sculptures were multifaceted. This one was asking you to look out at San Francisco and think about the 1906 earthquake. Let's see, this is a little tiny video. I think it's like 40 seconds long, gives you a little bit of sense of the experience. Oops. Oh. And it should have sound. And this is kind of what the AR would have looked like if you were at that site. I don't know why the sound's not working.
I don't know either.
Yeah, it's kind of, well, it's not essential for this, but anyway, you'd hear the gravel crunching in the grass. The interesting thing about this, and some students planted things as their art installation, and this is what you would have seen if you held up your camera to the activation image of the mosaic. This video was actually created by a consulting firm that is doing the City of Albany Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Master Plan. And so it's a really interesting example of how when you create something in public space, it contributes to a public process. And although we definitely wanted our project to help people understand more about this place and about the potential of this place as a place of learning, we didn't expect that the consultants would take the tour and like it so much that they made this little video that then I think has had an impact on the planning process for the open space in Albany, including this spot. So that, again, we were really pleased to see that. Okay. Next slide. And this is just going to show kind of the experience of scrolling through the website. So you go to the website, and then you can choose to click on a button to either download the walking tour, experience a virtual tour, you can download the podcast. So we tried to make it an easy point of entry. And then it's also like a little encyclopedia on that webpage where you can go and read the story, for example, of the Cornices Village Integrated Wartime Housing. And then on the website, we also shared images of the artworks that the student made. And then you can also experience the augmented reality slideshow or video that you would see. So if you were out at the site and you held your phone up, you would see this slideshow. So that is the example of, that's what the website was. Okay, now I'm going to play this. This is the virtual tour. Again, this is not what you would do if you were at the site. This is if you're at your house, you can manually, spin yourself around and choose which part of 360 degrees you see. And I'm hoping the sound will work for this, because this has the audio tour. So I'm not going to keep going with this just because but what you would be hearing is the same audio tour that you would have heard at the site, and you would be hearing the narration. And so having a virtual version of the experience there. But the sound's not working, so I'm just going to skip ahead. So our process, we were putting this together, during the pandemic, and we were all very tired and on Zoom, as everybody was. But we did our best. These were 4-hour Zoom sessions, right? So in terms of the class, during class, I would send students out to do exercises in their neighborhood, to do observations, to do mini interventions. And we tried to not be on screens for 4 hours straight, but you can see a variety of experiences going on, as is always the case. But we were able to go outside and do some field work, distanced and masked. And so we did some, kind of iterative processes of experimenting with making different kinds of sculptures. We had a couple of artists come and teach the students how to make mosaics. And we did a lot of being present in the place, back to the question of presence. And so the very first exercise we did at the site was to, before we gave the students any information at all, we created a kind of tour for them in which we asked them to, for example, sit very still, listen to sounds. What's the farthest sound you can hear? What's the nearest sound you can hear? And the piece of string was to tie in a circle, and you sit, and in this 2-foot circle, if you're very quiet, what do you see? What are the bugs and rocks? And, really being present. And Melody created this beautiful little packet where each of these was an invitation in an envelope, because we wanted the students to have the experience of the sort that we want to create for our visitors, right? Usually you go on a tour or field trip, somebody's talking down to you and telling you, you ought to know this about the place. We wanted it to be more of an invitation, a gift. So we started out with this gift for the students, asked them to ask, 100 questions. They did sketches, ask 100 questions. That's why I asked you to ask 100 questions about the Ohlone people in this Huichin territory. What are the questions, even if we can't answer them all? And the students did maps that were, emotional maps of the imagination. And then we also, so that was step one, just getting to physically know the place without any preconceptions. Then I took them on a tour, gave them a data dump, all kinds of EIRs, all kinds of history, a lot of information. Here's what we know about the place. Then asked them to go. We couldn't use archives in person, so they did a lot of research at the Bancroft and other library research. We brought in guest speakers, including Luis Trevino and Vincent Medina from Cafe Oloni, who gave one indigenous perspective, and I say an indigenous perspective because we really don't want to ask anybody to represent, quote unquote, the community of whatever community they are perceived as being part of, but they gave us a kind of baseline knowledge about some of the history of this coastline. We invited in, this is Cheryl Barton, landscape architect, who created, along with Susan Schwarzenberg and Donna Graves, the Rosie the Riveter National Historical Memorial. And so the students went and looked at, well, how are we telling stories? What's existing? What are existing techniques? And this is part of a large national park that's a multi-site scattered park in Richmond that also has a particular monument attached to it. So we tried to analyze and draw lessons from that. The work of the landscape architect Lawrence Halprin and Anna Halprin, choreographer, they were a husband and wife team who did a lot of work in performance and thinking about landscape as a kind of script or a score for our experiences was really important. Sharing, if you could share, Melody, the Halprin reading and readings about Halprin, I think it's really helpful in thinking about outdoor space. Gabe Caprielian, an architect, helped us think about sight lines, sunlight, and how to, think about where to locate. He helped us locate what we were, our places. The other thing that was interesting is these are students creating a painting of the Port of Oakland in front of where you can see the cranes in the background there. So it's like, here's a close-up view of what you're seeing in the background. But what's really important about this picture is that they were creating the work at the site. They didn't make it elsewhere and bring it in and plunk it in. At the Bulb, there's a history of people making things at the site, so you have to spend a lot of hours at the place. One thing that I've noticed is when people make a sculpture or something elsewhere, come and plunk it at the Bulb, it tends to get torn apart. There's something more welcomed, and pieces tend to be more loved if they are created out of local materials or on the site. And the students in this case had a chance to interact with a lot of people who said, what are you doing? And at first they were like, oh, are we getting into trouble? But no, people said, thank you. They learned what people knew about the place, what they didn't know about the place by being present and just sitting there for all the many hours it took to do this painting. Their interactions with visitors and people who might take the tour in the future, I think was really valuable to them. So ephemerality. So one student created this really interesting, her monument. So we call the art installations monuments. And some of them were very not monumental. They were extremely ephemeral, like this circle of poppies, which represented the really violent and terrible explosions, accidental explosions of the dynamite factories that actually broke windows all over the UC Berkeley campus. That's how powerful they were. Yet she represented these kind of circles of force with this very gentle expression that also maybe brought to mind, the lives that had been lost. And, who knows whether these will come back next season, but I think this is another example of thinking about, well, is something going to last longer in your memory or in community memory if it's made of stone or if it's made of a flower? The students interacted with the materials again, being really connected to the place. They made the sculptures mostly out of the bricks or the fennel or the stuff they made there. And which makes it very different from a traditional kind of historic tour where you have, a sign on, steel or fiberglass, nicely designed and printed, permanent. This is the story. This is the history of this place. We were saying, these are some of the stories that we thought belonged to this place. And they are provisional and they are temporary and they will be altered. And, some of the ephemerality or some of the non-physicality was the fact that it was an audio tour or that it was a digital tour. And other aspects of it were really super physical, that you were touching the bricks. So, in terms of like conclusions, what conclusions did we reach? The augmented reality, as those of you who went on the tour saw, was a little glitchy. Depending on your internet connection, it might not have worked. And it's also kind of hard to look at a real tiny screen outdoors in the glare. So I think it has a lot of potential. We also didn't have time to do a lot of iterations or to take full advantage of what the AR could do. So I feel like it was a question we asked. So I wouldn't say it was a success or a failure. We learned some things that are hard about using AR in that kind of site. The audio tour, people seem to really like the kind of intimacy of being told, the story as you walk along. It was not geolocated. There are some tour platforms that, know exactly where you are. It was okay that, you kind of had to figure out if you were in the right place or not. Sometimes a little confusing, but there are ways you could do the tour in a geolocated way. I think the students enjoyed and learned a lot from making the installations, the monuments. And for the visitor, I think it had the art pieces had an open-ended way of asking questions that kind of complemented the facts that we were trying to get across. On the website, you'll see a lot of facts. Even in the audio, there's a certain amount of facts that we're trying to get across. So I think having an opportunity to both draw your own conclusions while also being presented with some information, I think that worked. So I learned a lot from putting this tour together with the students, and it kind of spurred this colloquium because I had so many questions about, well, what's being done in the world? How are people using these technologies or techniques? What are the roots of, what makes a good story? Forget, any of the technology. How do we pass on knowledge orally or through dance or through food? How do these things come together? And then how do we layer them? And, back to the questions, who owns these stories? How, are the stories for ourselves? Are they, the same questions that Dave Peters was asking, who's this tour for? Those were all questions that we got to ask, and we didn't reach any conclusions, but I'll stop there. And I'd be happy to answer any questions or hear any comments that you have.
Yes, hi, my name is Solomon. Thank you for the presentation. It's wonderful. Two questions I have. I'm just reflecting back my first experience when I went there without even knowing this tour is available or about the podcast. I live nearby and I usually go around there, the trail. And first time I saw it was like, wow, I was confused. And then first I thought it was like landfill and place that is very stable or so. Then notice this intentional designs placed everywhere. I was trying to figure out that, so really helpful. So my question is, first, I feel like it's the design and it's still evolving. I noticed that things being added in a couple of weeks, in a month. So is it a continuous thing? That's one thing I thought, and maybe if you can speak about that and what it's heading into. And the other thing is about the choice of the art. Is there some kind of theme that maybe I don't understand, replicating or intentionally it's being followed, and it seems to me more of like a free style, people how they feel and experience, like you were saying, design it right there. But I was wondering if there is some kind of specific theme or art style that's being done here.
Yeah, well, as far as the intention of the individual art pieces, and I don't know if you're talking about the mosaics or kind of the more sculptural pieces, on the website, if you're interested in what the student's intention was, there's an artist statement. And so it explains. So like, for example, there was one sculpture in a tree that it was made of fennel sticks, but it represented railroad tracks, which you might or might not have seen. And it's fine whether or not you got that. But if you're interested in the artist statements, those are on the website. the assignment to the students on the monuments, on the artworks was very open-ended. So it was really however they decided to express their ideas.
Is it still moving, changing? Is that the plan?
So, I mean, we're not doing any further work on it. So any changes you see are, somebody else is adding to or taking down or whatever. So I'm sure that there will be changes, but it's not that currently they are not being curated by us.
Hi, my name is Anne. I was just wondering, you mentioned interventions that you would have students do, like what is that?
Oh, you mean in terms of the
Like
kind of,
during the classes, you said you would have them like walk around.
yeah, so one was just to identify mysteries in your neighborhood. So if you walk out your door, again, what are the questions you have? Like, why is the street named that? Or if there's something in the sidewalk, some stamp, what is that about? If you walk around your neighborhood and pay attention, there are many mysteries, right? And then we had them do, what did we have them do, Melody, to like create an installation? What were do you remember what some of the installations were as practice for, making something in public space?
One of them was like a 5-minute monument. We were in that process of creating a proposal, but actually building something. So we tried to pull that process back and think about what would be kind of a 10% of your monument proposal. Or if you were going to make a monument to books in 5 minutes, how would you assemble that? So quick, small exercises like that to just flex these kinds of small creations.
Right. And then see how they behave. So like, I don't remember if anybody did this, but like, in the median strip, if you piled 5 rocks, how long would they stay piled, or would somebody rearrange them? Like intervening in public space and then seeing what happens is what we're after. Yeah.
I'm Moffat. Thank you for this presentation. I did the tour this morning, really outstanding. So congrats to you and your team. But I had a question for you specific about the relationship with the city. You mentioned that afterwards the consultants used video. Was there any interaction with the city prior to your project? I'm just curious what that was all about, their perspective.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't have any direct interaction with the city. So I, since 2016, have been putting on different events at the Bulb, some of which are tours, dance festivals, musical performances, sometimes, art workshops, that kind of thing. And we had a kind of very loose permit from the city to do that, which was just expiring, and to do quote unquote temporary installations. So this was just expiring at the time that we were doing this project. So it was kind of semi-guerrilla. The city did not object. They did not support. They just, like everything else at the Bulb, it just kind of happened. We didn't keep it a secret. Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
My name is Luke. Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering what originally inspired your project at the Bulb, or perhaps if there were other installations in California or elsewhere that inspired your work on this.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess my own inspiration was just being curious about the chunks of concrete, like what part of a highway overpass does this come from? What is this rebar used for? What is this thing? So I had a lot of questions. That was one inspiration for me. As far as kind of other art projects, I guess you can see precedents in everything from historic parks or the Freedom Trail in Boston where you follow a line and it takes you from place to place. I think there are other spots with guerrilla art, but our intention was not so much to create individual artistic works, right? But to get people to pause. And I'm sure, a lifetime of looking at things kind of put inspirations in my head, but I'm not thinking specifically right now of what those things are. But, going on other audio tours that I really liked definitely made me want to create something like that. There was a company called Detour that created really wonderful, very detailed audio tours that were geolocated. And in fact, there was a really wonderful one made about the bulb and about made with the people who had lived there, and they were narrating it. And unfortunately, that's not available anymore because that guide, that audio tour company was acquired. But I'm hoping I can somehow make it available because it's a really valuable layer of the history there. And it was a really well done walking tour that didn't, have any physical installations attached to it.
There's a question from public attendees,
Mm-hmm.
so I'll read it out. So from Devin McCutcheon, who I believe is a state park interpreter,
Mm-hmm.
is interested to hear your thoughts on the long-term outcomes of supporting individuals to develop their own deeper local spatial awareness. What are the politics of that? What do you imagine it might produce? Do you see it as a political practice to help people cultivate this local spatial awareness?
Yeah, I think that's like the most valuable thing that we can do is for people to develop their own version of the history. And I think that public agencies are constrained in what they can put on a brass plaque or in an official exhibit. And I think that's why, to the extent that in our parks, if we can provide opportunities for artists to ask questions and to help people create their own, maybe their own interventions, that allows for a greater diversity of stories. I mean, in museums, we often see, there's an interactive thing where they have paper and pencils and it asks you a question, well, what do you think about this part of the exhibit? Or, draw a picture of how this makes you feel. And, sometimes those may be effective, but I always feel like they're not quite achieving always what they're hoping to do. Whereas when something is as open-ended as the bulb, and people are allowed to just like hang a picture frame in a tree, which is their statement of, look at this view, it helps everyone ask their own questions. But that's very hard to do in a conventional park, right? That's the beauty of the bulb, is that people can make their own physical interventions that are more interesting than just writing a comment card at a museum. I think, creating those kinds of opportunities for people in public spaces is very labor intensive because it's a constant act of recreation. It takes staff, it takes the effort that I was talking about that is needed for festivals and reenactments, and having a brass plaque or an interpretive panel, it's once and done. And that's the problem, right? So how do we create opportunities that are not once and done, and especially to help people understand that history is not what happened, history is the stories we tell. and the stories that we're constantly creating. And how do we allow people to have the experience of creating a story and having that story compete with or be in dialogue with the other stories at the place. But those kind of embodied and performative stories are also very challenging and can be problematic, as we see, at tours of plantations, at, tours where people dress up to play whatever role in whatever script they're asked to play. Yeah, it's a really interesting task that I think that the parks interpretive folks have.
So, yeah, that's the question. My name's Shelby, and I was just curious if you've heard any updates about what the master plan might have in mind for the goal.
It looks like it's probably going to be status quo for a while. And so those of us who are involved in that process are hoping that the activities that we've been doing, including this installation and tour, will show that kind of letting things be is a good route. And I think if we can get that notion into the master plan, it would be a good thing. So.